There was a time when humanity stood on the edge of extinction. Entire landscapes were transformed, climates shifted beyond recognition, and the world our ancestors knew disappeared forever. Yet from one of the greatest disasters in history came a new beginning, one that reshaped human civilization and changed our future forever. What really happened during this forgotten turning point, and how did it force humanity into a completely new age? Stay with us as we uncover one of the most extraordinary survival stories ever told. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next journey into history's greatest mysteries. The first sign is not a city falling, not a king dying, not an army crossing a border. It is dust in the light. It hangs above the ground in a thin, unnatural veil, turning morning into something dim and metallic. Across a wide, prehistoric landscape, the air tastes bitter. The sun rises, but it gives less warmth than it should. Animals move restlessly along old paths that no longer lead to the same water. Riverbanks crack where mud should be soft. In some places the ground is buried under pale ash. In others, forests stand silent under a sky that seems to have forgotten its seasons. For the people living through it, there is no word for climate system, no chart of rainfall, no memory of volcanic aerosols or collapsed ecosystems. There is only the old world behaving in a way it has never behaved before, and the terrifying realization that inherited knowledge may no longer be enough. This is where the story begins, at the edge between one human age and another, in a moment when disaster does not simply destroy but rearranges the rules of survival. Long before cities, long before writing, long before the first kings ordered walls to rise from mud brick, human communities already carry deep intelligence in their hands and memories. They know where herds pass in a cold season. They know which roots can be eaten, which stones split cleanly, which river bend offers fish after rain, which ridge gives warning of approaching danger. Their world is not simple. It is mapped with generations of observation. Yet a disaster can break even the most careful map. A spring can fail. A herd can vanish. A coast can drown. A valley can turn hostile. When that happens, people do not merely suffer. They choose improvise move, gather separate remember, and sometimes create something that did not exist before. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the strangest part of this ancient story is not only that catastrophe came, it is that something recognizably new may have emerged from the pressure it created. The disaster that forced humanity into a new age is not a single neat event, preserved like a broken pot in the ground. It is better understood as a convergence of shocks, a chain of environmental violence and human response that unfolded across landscapes at the end of the Ice Age and into the beginning of a world more familiar to us. Scholars still debate the exact weight of each cause. Some point to abrupt climate swings. Others emphasize volcanic eruptions, megafloods, droughts, sea level rise, ecological collapse, or the slow exhaustion of older ways of life. No single explanation fully accounts for this transformation, but what survives in the record suggests that humanity did not walk calmly into the next age. It was pushed. Imagine a land that has known cold for longer than any living person can measure. Great ice sheets still dominate the far north. Their edges grind slowly across continents, locking away water and shaping winds. Beyond them stretch grasslands, step-open woodland and river corridors where animals move in numbers difficult to picture now. Mammoths, wild horses, reindeer, bison, aurochs, deer, and smaller creatures form a living economy for human groups who follow trap, scavenge, hunt, gather, and return. In warmer regions, people occupy caves, rock shelters, lakesides, coastlines, and seasonal camps. They make blades from stone needles, from bone beads, from shells, pigments from minerals, and stories from the dangerous brilliance of the world around them. Their societies are not primitive in the lazy sense that modern imagination sometimes prefers. They're skilled, alert, flexible, and deeply adapted. But adaptation has a hidden weakness. It works best when the world remains within known limits. When the same animals return, when edible plants ripen within expected windows, when rivers flood and retreat in remembered rhythms, tradition becomes a form of technology. It saves energy. It keeps children alive. It allows elders to teach not abstract theory, but tested patterns. Disaster attacks those patterns first. It turns wisdom into uncertainty. A valley remembered for game becomes empty. A coast known for shellfish slips beneath rising water. A familiar cold becomes deeper, or a familiar thaw comes too violently, sending meltwater through river systems with destructive force. Even a small change repeated season after season can become a quiet catastrophe. A failed winter camp means hunger. 2 failed seasons mean movement. A generation of instability means culture itself begins to change. The evidence remains incomplete because these people leave no written complaint, no official record of famine, no carved monument saying the sky darkened and the old routes failed. Their history survives in fragments that must be read carefully, a scatter of tools where a camp once stood a layer of ash in lake sediment pollen grains, showing which plants disappeared, bones cut by stone edges, charcoal from ancient fires, shells carried far from the sea, genetic traces of movement and mixing the sudden appearance of new habits in places where older ones fade. Archaeology rarely gives the drama all at once. It gives hints, and those hints have to be arranged against ice cores, cave deposits, river sediments, and the slow testimony of Earth itself. From this patient reconstruction, a pattern begins to appear. Around the time the Ice Age world is breaking apart, humans face not one change, but many. The planet warms, but not smoothly. Ice retreats, but its retreat brings floods, unstable coastlines, shifting habitats, and sudden reversals. In some regions, a warming trend opens new possibilities. In others, it removes the very conditions on which people and animals have depended. Then come abrupt cold snaps dry, centuries wet pulses, volcanic winters, and regional disasters that do not respect human plans. The old belief that history begins with farming misses something essential. Before fields and villages can appear, people must first pass through a world where mobility, memory, and risk are being rewritten. Farming is not simply an invention born from comfort. In many places, it may also be a response to stress crowding opportunity and loss. The road towards settled life is long, uneven, and full of failed experiments. Yet disaster gives it urgency. There is a haunting irony here. The disasters that threaten human survival may also concentrate human imagination. When people are forced into smaller refuges, richer river valleys, or dependable springs, they encounter one another more often. Ideas travel, tools change, food is stored more carefully, ritual spaces become more important, boundaries sharpen, cooperation grows more necessary, but so does conflict. A group that once followed herds across broad seasonal ranges may begin to return again and again to the same productive place. A plant once gathered casually may become protected, encouraged, eventually planted. A shelter once temporary may acquire memory, burial, ownership, and meaning. Nothing happens overnight. The evidence does not support a simple tale in which one catastrophe instantly creates civilization, but it does suggest that pressure changes the value of staying, storing, planning, and organizing. Somewhere in this long upheaval, humanity begins to look different in the archaeological record. Not biologically different in the sense of becoming a new species, but socially different, economically different, spiritually different. The human mind has long been capable of art planning, symbolic thought, and technical mastery. The New Age is not born because people suddenly become intelligent. It is born because old intelligence meets new conditions. A changing world forces ancient communities to ask more from their tools, their alliances, their food sources, and their landscapes. That is why the disaster matters. It does not stand apart from human history as background scenery. It enters the structure of life itself. At first there is only dust in the light hunger at the edge of camp, strange weather over familiar hills, the absence of animals where tracks should be. Then there is movement, then memory, then experiment, then settlement. The catastrophe is not the end of the human story. It is one of the great hinges within it, a shadowed doorway through which scattered bands, frightened families, hunters, gatherers, toolmakers and storytellers begin moving toward a world of villages, fields, monuments and consequences. The New Age does not arrive cleanly. It arrives under a troubled sky carrying ash on the wind. Before the disaster becomes visible, the world is already carrying strain beneath its surface. It is not a peaceful Eden waiting to be interrupted by one spectacular event. It is a planet in transition, restless from pole to equator, still shaped by the long grip of ice and the uneven release of warmth. Human groups live inside this uncertainty with remarkable skill, but their lives depend on patterns that are beginning to loosen. The late prehistoric world is full of abundance in some places and danger in others, and its richness can be deceptive. A broad plain filled with grazing animals may look eternal to the eyes of one generation, yet from the perspective of climate and geology, it may be temporary, a passing arrangement created by ice-wind rainfall and plant life balanced in a fragile way. Across the northern continents, enormous ice sheets still influence everything, even where they cannot be seen. Their cold breath changes the paths of storms. Their weight presses land downward. Their melting feeds rivers that run with a force modern landscapes often hide. Sea levels remain lower than they will later become, exposing coastal plains and land bridges that connect places now separated by water. In some regions, people walk across territories that future oceans will claim completely. What later generations know as seabed is for these communities hunting ground, campground, path, marsh and memory. The evidence remains incomplete because many of those landscapes now lie drowned beneath silt and waves. But what survives suggests that some of humanity's most important routes may have crossed worlds that no longer exist above water. In Western Eurasia, open steppe and cold grassland support animals adapted to harsh exposed country. In the Near East woodlands, grasslands, river valleys and seasonal wetlands create a mosaic of opportunity. In Africa, some regions hold lakes and green corridors where later deserts will dominate, while other zones are already dry enough to demand careful movement and intimate knowledge of water. Farther east, monsoon systems, coastlines, forests, mountains and river basins shape different human strategies. There is no single prehistoric lifestyle. Some communities depend heavily on large animals. Others fish, gather shellfish, collect wild grains, trap small game, dig tubers, hunt birds and move between ecological zones with the sophistication that can be easy to underestimate. What unites them is not sameness but dependence on rhythm. Those rhythms are everywhere. Seeds ripen when days lengthen. Herds pass through valleys when snow retreats. Fish gather when waters change. Birds arrive and vanish along invisible routes. Nuts, berries, grasses, roots, and shellfish each have their season. People learn these timings not from written calendars, but from body stories marks repeated journeys and the memory of elders. A child grows up hearing when to expect the animals, where to search after a storm, which hill holds flint, which spring survives late in the dry season, which plants are generous but only for a short time. This knowledge is precise because it has to be. A mistake is not an inconvenience. It can mean weakness before winter, hunger during migration, or exposure at the wrong moment. Yet even before the great turning point, the old Ice Age order is not stable. Some animals are already under pressure from shifting vegetation and changing temperature. Human hunting may contribute in certain places, though scholars still debate how much it matters compared with climate. The story is complicated because ecosystems do not collapse for one reason alone. A species can survive cold but suffer when wet grasslands become forest. Another can survive hunting but fail when breeding grounds shrink. A herd can move beyond a group's reach without going extinct at all. For people who depend on those animals, the result is the same: the map changes. A reliable route becomes uncertain. The edge of hunger moves closer. There are also pressures created by human success. By this time, modern humans have spread across astonishing distances. They occupy coasts, caves, river valleys, highlands, forests and plains. They carry ornaments, symbolic practices, long-distance material exchange and refined technologies. Some groups make delicate stone blades. Others shape bone and antler into tools of impressive precision. Sewing clothing shelters, storage pits, pigments, fishing equipment, and composite weapons all speak to minds capable of planning far beyond the immediate moment. But wider occupation also means that empty lands are not always empty anymore. When climate pushes one group away from a failing region, another group may already be using the place they need to enter. Pressure does not merely come from weather. It comes from neighbors, boundaries, competition, alliance, marriage exchange, and the difficult politics of survival without states. The surprising detail hidden in this ancient world is how much of later human life already exists in embryo. People are not waiting for agriculture to become social, symbolic, or inventive. They bury their dead with care in some places. They use pigments that may carry meanings now lost. They move shells, stone, and other materials over distances that suggest networks of contact. They return to certain places repeatedly, not because they are trapped there, but because those places matter. Some communities build shelters strong enough to suggest seasonal planning. Others gather in larger numbers at unusually rich locations. The difference between a mobile camp and a future settlement is not always a sharp line. It is a gradual thickening of attachment. Still, attachment can become dangerous. A group deeply adapted to one river valley, one migratory herd, one wetland, or one chain of seasonal camps may thrive for centuries until the conditions that support that system begin to fail. The more specialized a community becomes, the more vulnerable it may be when the world shifts outside expected limits. Flexibility is one of humanity's oldest strengths, but flexibility has costs. Moving requires knowledge of where to move. Changing food requires time, trial, and risk. Joining with others requires trust. Defending territory requires strength. Leaving ancestors behind may carry emotional and ritual weight that archaeology can only faintly detect. What survives in the record suggests that prehistoric people were not drifting through empty wilderness. They lived in landscapes layered with memory. This is the world the disaster enters, not a blank stage, but a web of relationships between people, animals, weather, water, stone, plants, and place. The coming shock matters because it strikes a system already stretched by transition. The end of the Ice Age does not unfold as a smooth gift of warmth. It produces unstable borders between old and new environments. Forests advance in some regions while grasslands retreat. Lakes swell, vanish or turn saline. Rivers change course. Coasts creep upward as seas rise. The same warming that opens northern lands can drown southern shores. The same melting that releases water can unleash floods. The same ecological richness that gathers people can make them more dependent on a few precious places. So before the ash falls, before the cold returns, before drought tightens its grip, or waters rise over old camps, humanity already stands at a threshold. The old world is still recognizable, but it is becoming less dependable. Its animals still move, but not always where they once did. Its seasons still turn, but not always with the same force. Its people still carry the knowledge of countless generations, but knowledge made for one world may not perfectly fit the next. Disaster does not create vulnerability from nothing. It finds the hairline cracks already running through the age, and then it widens them. The pattern breaks not with a single sound heard everywhere, but with a series of disturbances that travel through the living world like cracks through drying clay. In one region, the shock may begin as a sky darkened by volcanic dust, a season of strange light and weakened warmth. In another, it may come as waters released from melting ice, surging through valleys with a force that erases banks, camps, and familiar crossings. Elsewhere, it arrives more slowly as rain withdraws from a grassland, as lakes shrink from their old shorelines, as trees advance into hunting country, or vanish from slopes that once held shade. To the people living through these changes, the disaster is not an abstract event with one date and one name. It is a betrayal of expectation. The old signs no longer lead to old results. The late Ice Age and early post-Ice Age world does not change politely. Its climate can shift with startling speed, sometimes within the span of a human lifetime, sometimes faster than traditions can comfortably absorb. Warming pulses melt ice and raise seas, but then cold reversals interrupt the trend. Wet centuries are followed by dry ones. River systems swell under meltwater and then settle into new courses. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the precise timing and causes of many regional crises, but the broad picture is clear enough: the world that had supported older ways of living is losing its old shape. This is the turning point. Disaster becomes not merely an episode of destruction, but a force that pushes human communities to reorganize. One of the strangest features of this transformation is that warming itself can be dangerous. Modern instinct often imagines cold as the enemy and warmth as relief. But for Ice Age people and animals, warmth can dismantle an entire way of life. Open steppe tundra and cold grassland are not empty wastelands. They are productive habitats for certain animals and for the humans who know how to live with them. When temperatures rise, plants change, shrubs move, forests spread, the grazing world fragments. Animals that once travelled visibly across wide country now retreat, adapt, or decline. Hunters who know the old movement routes find themselves reading signs that no longer match the terrain. More trees may mean more wood and more plant foods in some places, but fewer long views, fewer herd concentrations, and different risks. A richer world for one species can be a collapsing world for another. Then come the floods. As ice sheets weaken, water trapped for ages begins to move. Lakes form against walls of ice and sediment. Natural dams fail. Valleys that have known rivers become corridors of violence. Far from the ice itself, the consequences can still arrive through changing waterways, rising seas, and drowned coasts. Low plains that once connected lands disappear gradually in some places and dramatically in others. Campsites, burial grounds, shellfish beds, and paths sink beyond memory. Archaeology struggles here because so many coastal traces lie underwater, hidden beneath sediment or destroyed by later waves. What survives in the record suggests that prehistoric shorelines were not marginal spaces. They were among the most attractive places to live, offering fish, shellfish, birds, plants, fresh water, and movement routes. When the sea rises, it does not only take land, it takes some of the easiest living in the ancient world. In other regions, water does the opposite. It withdraws. A lake that once gathers animals and people begins to shrink, exposing mud, then salt, then empty flats. A spring weakens, a grassland thins. The dry season lengthens beyond what stored knowledge can comfortably manage. Drought rarely announces itself as catastrophe at first. It begins as inconvenience, then worry, then failed return. People arrive at a place where water should be and find less than expected. Animals bunch around remaining sources, making hunting easier for a brief time, then harder as populations decline or move away. Plants that once ripen reliably become patchy. The old circuit of seasonal movement grows longer, more dangerous, and more crowded. Volcanic eruptions add another kind of shock. A major eruption can throw ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, dimming sunlight and cooling regions for months or years. Ash can poison water, damage plants, irritate lungs, and leave a pale layer that later archaeologists recognize as a time marker. Not every eruption transforms the world, and it would be misleading to blame all human change on volcanic catastrophe alone. Yet volcanic events matter because they can strike already stressed systems. A single bad year in a flexible world can be endured. A single bad year during ecological transition can become the moment when a community abandons a place, changes its food strategy, or loses the confidence of inherited roots. No single explanation fully accounts for the larger transformation, but layered shocks can create a pressure greater than any one cause. There may also have been sudden regional cold snaps that turned recovery into confusion. The world begins to warm, plants and animals adjust. People adapt, and then cold returns with force. Younger landscapes newly opened by melting ice become unstable. The growing season shortens. Snow patterns shift. Herd movements change again. Such reversals are especially dangerous because they punish adaptation itself. People who've begun to rely on new resources may find those resources interrupted. Groups that moved into promising territories may discover that promise withdrawn. A disaster is not always the opposite of change. Sometimes it is change changing direction too quickly. This is why the catastrophe should be understood as a broken pattern rather than one simple blow. For generations, human survival has depended on reading the world. Tracks in mud-flowering plants, bird migrations, the taste of wind, the condition of animal fat, the depth of snow, the height of river water, the colour of grasses near a spring. All of these are forms of information. When the climate shifts abruptly, information becomes less trustworthy. The past no longer predicts the near future. That is a profound crisis for societies that store knowledge in memory movement and repeated practice. Their tools still work, their intelligence remains, their courage does not vanish. But the landscape has changed the terms of the agreement. A lesser-known detail in this story is that crisis can appear archaeologically as both loss and creativity at the same time. Some sites are abandoned, some tool traditions fade, some animal remains become rarer, yet elsewhere new combinations appear different. Hunting equipment, broader diets, more intensive, gathering of small foods, greater use of grinding stones, deeper storage, more permanent structures, and stronger signs of repeated occupation. These are not always signs of comfort. Often they may be signs of pressure. People are expanding the menu because the old menu is unreliable. They are storing more because tomorrow is harder to trust. They are returning to productive places because the wider landscape is less generous than it once was. The turning point is therefore not a single dramatic day when humanity steps from one age into another. It is a long emergency uneven across continents remembered by no written witness, yet inscribed in sediments, bones, pollen, stone, and drowned terrain. It breaks the old pattern by making movement harder, predictability weaker, and cooperation more necessary. Across the troubled earth, people face the same ancient problem in different forms. The world they understand is becoming a world they must learn again. The first true terror of a changing world is not always the moment of violence. It is the season that refuses to arrive correctly. A flood can be witnessed, an eruption can be seen in ash, a fire can be smelled on the wind, but a broken season is more unsettling because it corrupts the ordinary. The sky still brightens, birds still move, plants still push through soil, yet everything comes too early, too late, too weakly, or in the wrong place. The people waiting beside a familiar river see water rise at an unfamiliar time. Those who follow herds reach a crossing and find no tracks. Those who depend on wild grain discover that the seed heads are thinner scattered or already gone. The world is not silent, but its signals have become difficult to trust. For communities living near the end of the Ice Age, the calendar is not a carved object hanging on a wall. It is a pattern held in the body and in collective memory. The return of warmth tells people when to leave a winter shelter. The swelling of buds tells them when certain routes may be ready. The melting of snow opens mountain passes or makes them dangerous with sudden water. The condition of animal coats and fat reveals the season's progress. Everything important is tied to timing. When that timing changes, people are forced into decisions with less certainty than before. A group may leave too soon and meet snow. It may leave too late and miss animals. It may arrive at a fishing place after the run has passed. It may wait for rains that do not come, consuming energy and hope at the same time. The instability does not affect every region in the same way. In some places, warming brings a longer growing season and more edible plants, but also new diseases, new insects, and the spread of forests into open hunting grounds. In other places, cold reversals shorten the warm months and make plant foods less dependable. Drying turns lakes into shrinking basins surrounded by mud salt and desperate animal traffic. Wetter periods may create marshes rich in birds and fish, but they can also make travel difficult, drown camps, and change the places where game gathers. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because many seasonal camps leave only faint traces, but the environmental record shows that ancient people were living through a patchwork of shifting opportunities and losses. One of the most important effects of erratic seasons is that they break the balance between mobility and return. For a highly mobile group, movement is strength. A community can follow resources rather than force resources to remain. But movement depends on a chain of known places. One camp is useful because another lies within reach. One water source matters because it connects to the next. One hunting ground works because animals can be expected to appear during a certain window. If several links in that chain weaken at once, movement becomes more dangerous. Distance stretches. Children, elders, and stored materials become harder to carry. The group has to decide what to abandon, who can travel, and how much risk to take. What looks from far away like wandering may in reality be a carefully managed system under stress. Failed seasons also change the meaning of food. In a stable year, people may prefer large animals or familiar plant foods because they offer high return for known effort. In an unstable year, survival may depend on broadening the diet. Small animals, fish, shellfish, seeds, nuts, roots, insects, and plants requiring longer processing become more important. This shift is visible in some archaeological records as a wider range of remains and more tools connected to grinding, pounding, scraping, or processing. That does not mean people suddenly discover these foods. Many had known them for generations. The change is in intensity. Foods once used occasionally may become central. Labor once unnecessary becomes routine. A seed that was once gathered in passing may become worth protecting, transporting, or encouraging near a camp. Here a quiet revolution begins inside daily work. A landscape that no longer gives easily demands more planning. Grain heads must be cut, carried, dried, stored, and guarded from moisture, rodents, insects, and other people. Nuts must be cracked and sometimes leached. Roots must be dug with effort. Fish must be trapped, dried, smoked, or eaten quickly. Shellfish provide dependable nutrition in some coastal zones, but they also tie people to shorelines that rising seas may later erase. None of this is glamorous, and much of it leaves only modest traces. Yet these habits matter because they train communities to think differently about time. Food is no longer only chased across the land. It is accumulated. It is delayed. It is defended. It becomes a bridge between a failed season and the next uncertain one. Unstable weather also changes shelter. A camp used briefly during a predictable migration may not need to be elaborate, but when people wait longer near a reliable water source or return repeatedly to a place where food can be stored, structures become more substantial. Post holes, hearths, floors, storage pits, and repeated rebuilding begin to signal deeper attachment. Scholars still debate how often such features reflect environmental pressure rather than cultural preference, because people settle or gather for many reasons. But it is difficult to ignore the connection between uncertainty and the desire to create dependable places. A roof, a wall, a hearth, and a stored meal are not only practical objects, they are arguments against chaos. The human body records the stress in ways archaeology can sometimes glimpse. Bones and teeth may show signs of nutritional strain, interrupted growth, disease, or heavy labor. Burials may reveal care, injury, conflict, or changing ritual attention. These clues must be interpreted cautiously. A single skeleton cannot stand for an entire age, and preserved remains are never an even sample of the living. Still, what survives in the record suggests that climate pressure can enter bodies directly. Hunger is not an idea. It thins, muscle weakens, immunity, alters pregnancy, slows children, and makes every journey harder. When seasons stop behaving, the crisis is carried in skin-bone memory and fear. There is also a psychological dimension that rarely leaves clear evidence. A community that has inherited successful knowledge from its elders may face a painful contradiction when that knowledge begins to fail. The elders are not wrong in any simple sense. They remember a world that truly existed. The young are not reckless when they try unfamiliar strategies. They're responding to conditions that have changed. This tension, almost invisible archaeologically, may be one of the engines of the new age. Innovation is not always a celebration. Sometimes it is a disagreement with necessity behind it. New tools, new foods, new movement patterns, and new gathering places may emerge from the pressure between memory and altered reality. As seasons grow less dependable, people may become more attentive to signs that promise order. The sky animal, behavior, plant cycles, and unusual events acquire heavier meaning. Ritual practices may intensify around death, fertility animals, water, or celestial patterns, though the evidence remains open to interpretation. It would be too simple to say disaster creates religion because symbolic life is far older than this crisis. But disaster can sharpen the need for explanation. When the world behaves unpredictably, communities may seek ways to bind fear into ceremony, memory, and place. A burial, a gathering, A carved stone or a repeated return to a special landscape can become a way of saying that the world still has structure even when seasons seem to deny it. By the time the old rhythms have failed repeatedly, humanity is not merely enduring bad weather. It is being taught a harsh new lesson. Survival can no longer depend entirely on following the inherited calendar of the wild. The river may rise differently. The herd may choose another route. The plants may ripen out of time. The coast may retreat into the sea. The sky may dim behind dust. From this confusion comes a deeper transformation. People begin to value places that hold through uncertainty, foods that can be stored, alliances that widen access, tools that solve unfamiliar problems, and memories that can adapt rather than simply repeat. The seasons have stopped behaving, and in their disorder, a different human future begins to take shape. The old routes are first noticed by their emptiness. A valley that once carried the heavy movement of hooves lies open under the wind. Mud keeps only scattered marks where there should be a churned path. The hunters who understand the land by habit pause at ridgelines and river bends, reading the ground with the patience of people whose lives depend on small signs. They find dung too old to matter, broken shrubs without fresh browsing bones from animals that passed in another season, perhaps another year. The absence itself becomes information. Something has shifted beyond the reach of memory. The animals that once made the landscape predictable are no longer keeping their ancient appointments. For Ice Age and early post-Ice Age communities, animals are not simply food. They are movement, clothing tools, fuel, art, story, and structure. A large animal can feed many people. Its hide can become shelter or covering. Its bones and antlers can become points, needles, handles, ornaments, and supports. Its sinew can bind. Its fat can sustain. Even dung in treeless regions can be fuel. Around animal migrations, people organize journeys, meetings, hunting strategies, teaching, and perhaps ritual attention. When key animal populations decline or move away, a human world loses more than meat. It loses a calendar. It loses routes through the year. The end of the Ice Age transforms animal life across vast regions, though not evenly, and not for one simple reason. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, steppe bison in some areas, wild horses in certain landscapes, and other large mammals face shrinking or changing habitats. Some disappear entirely from broad regions, some survive longer in refuges, some adapt better than others. In North America, Eurasia, and parts of the wider world, late quaternary extinctions remain one of the great debates in paleontology and archaeology. Scholars still debate the relative roles of climate change, habitat fragmentation, human hunting disease, and cascading ecological stress. What survives in the records suggests that no single explanation fully accounts for every disappearance in every region. The losses occur in different places at different times under different pressures, and that unevenness matters. Climate alone can be devastating because large animals often depend on landscapes that are bigger than any single valley. The mammoth steppe, for example, was not merely cold ground. It was a productive mixture of grasses, herbs, and open terrain shaped by climate, grazing, and soil conditions. As warming advances, moisture patterns shift. Snow cover changes, shrubs and forests spread in some places, and the open grazing system breaks apart. Animals adapted to wide, dry, cold grasslands may find their world reduced to fragments. A herd can survive a hard winter. It can move after a local failure. But when the entire map of suitable habitat contracts and splinters, movement becomes less effective. The animal's strength becomes trapped by geography. Human hunting adds another layer, especially where animals are already stressed or where human groups expand into new territories. It is unlikely that every extinction can be explained by simple overhunting, and it is equally unlikely that human pressure did not matter anywhere. Large mammals often reproduce slowly. Losing even modest numbers at vulnerable times can affect populations if climate has already narrowed their options. People may target the healthiest animals, the most accessible herds, or animals trapped by water, snow, mud, or terrain. The evidence remains incomplete because a kill site is only one kind of trace, and absence can be difficult to interpret. Yet cut-marked bones, spear points, butchery sites, and changing faunal assemblages show that humans are part of the story, not outside it. For human communities, the collapse or movement of animals creates immediate practical problems. A toolkit designed for one hunting strategy may become less useful when prey changes. Long-range pursuit across open ground differs from forest hunting, trapping small animals, fishing, or gathering plant foods. Weapons may need to become lighter, more varied, or more specialized. Points change shape. Bone and antler tools take on new roles. Nets, traps, hooks, harpoons, grinding stones, baskets, and storage features become more important in some regions. This does not mean people forget how to hunt. It means the balance of labor changes. The old heroic image of hunters following mammoths across endless plains gives way to a more complex reality of families processing seeds, collecting shellfish, trapping birds, smoking fish, digging roots, repairing shelters, and watching the sky. A lesser-known consequence of animal decline is the loss of animal-made landscapes. Large grazers do not merely live in an environment, they help create it. They crop vegetation, trample soil, spread seeds, disturb snow-open paths, and recycle nutrients. When their numbers fall, plant communities change again. Shrubs may thicken, forest edges may close, fire behavior can shift, smaller animals respond, predators lose prey. Humans entering these altered landscapes encounter not just fewer animals, but different terrain underfoot. The disappearance of a herd can make a valley less open, less visible, less familiar, and harder to cross. In this way, extinction is not a single empty space in the food chain. It is a redesign of the world. The symbolic cost may be just as profound. Many Ice Age images, carvings, ornaments, and ritual traces show deep attention to animals. The exact meanings are debated and often unknowable, but the intensity is unmistakable. Animals occupy the imagination. They appear on cave walls, portable objects, worked bone, and perhaps in stories that leave no physical mark. They are feared, desired, honored, studied, and transformed into signs. When animal worlds change, human thought must change with them. A creature that once filled the horizon may become rare, then remembered, then ancestral, then mythical. What begins as ecological loss may become cultural memory. This may help explain why some ancient traditions appear to hold unusually powerful memories of vanished creatures, great floods, burning skies, or transformed landscapes, though such connections must be treated carefully. Oral memory can preserve real events in altered form, but it can also reshape them beyond recognition. It would be too easy to claim that every monster, giant, or sacred beast is a direct memory of Ice Age extinction. Most such claims go beyond the evidence. Still, the disappearance of major animals would have been emotionally and socially enormous for people who lived among them. The last sighting of a familiar species in a region may not have been recognized as the last. More likely, absence grew gradually, with each failed return adding weight to the unease. As animals vanish from the old routes, people are forced to reevaluate the meaning of land. A broad hunting territory that once supported mobility may no longer provide enough. A river-mouth wetland nut grove or wild grain stand may become more valuable than a distant open plain. Places that concentrate diverse resources begin to matter intensely. Communities may gather more often around lakes, springs, coasts, and ecotones, where several kinds of food can be found within reach. The disaster does not command humanity to settle, but it changes the arithmetic. Following a disappearing world becomes less rewarding. Returning to a dependable place becomes more attractive. This is one of the quiet hinges of human history. The fading of animal abundance helps push people toward broader diets, repeated camps, storage, territorial awareness, and eventually the management of plants and animals themselves. Domestication is still far away in many regions, and it does not emerge from desperation alone. It requires opportunity, knowledge, suitable species, and long experimentation. But the emotional and practical wound left by unreliable wild herds may have made control more desirable. If the animals no longer come when expected, if the old routes no longer feed the living, then survival begins to lean toward a different dream, not simply following life across the land, but drawing life closer, holding it near, and trying to make the future stay. The first maps of the crisis are not drawn on skin bark or stone. They are scattered across the ground in broken blades, abandoned hearths, altered camps, and unfamiliar tool shapes appearing where older habits fade. To modern eyes, these traces can seem quiet, almost too small to carry the weight of disaster. A flint flake, a burned seed, a bone point, a cluster of shells, a pit filled with ash, a campsite used once and never again. Yet this is how deep human upheaval often survives. There is no written warning, no formal record of panic, no carved account of a family leaving a valley after the herds fail. There is only the pattern of presence and absence, and within that pattern, movement begins to appear. When people are forced to move, they do not always travel like a single wave. They splinter. Some families may leave early following rumour memory or distant kin. Others stay until staying becomes impossible. A few may retreat into refuges, river valleys, uplands, caves, lake margins, forests, coasts, or spring-fed basins, where resources remain dependable after surrounding lands weaken. Archaeology rarely catches the moment of decision itself. What survives in the record suggests movement after the fact. New materials arriving from faraway old sites, thinning settlement patterns, shifting unfamiliar technologies appearing beside local traditions. The evidence remains incomplete, but the broad effect is unmistakable. As the environment changes, human geography changes with it. One clue lies in stone. Stone tools are durable, and because different rocks often come from identifiable sources, they can reveal routes of movement and exchange. A blade made from high-quality flint may appear far from the outcrop where the stone was gathered. Obsidian, where it exists, can be traced with remarkable precision to volcanic sources, sometimes showing connections over surprising distances. These materials do not always mean whole communities migrated. They may reflect trade, seasonal travel, gift exchange, marriage ties, or meetings between groups. But during times of disruption, changes in stone movement can suggest altered networks. A shrinking resource zone may push people toward new contacts. A blocked route may break old connections. A newly important gathering place may draw materials from many directions. The camps themselves also change. Some sites once used repeatedly become thin or vanish from the record. Others become more crowded, more complex, or more persistent. At certain favourable locations, archaeologists find repeated occupation layers, dense refuse storage features, hearths, grinding stones, animal bones, shells, ornaments, and signs of repair and rebuilding. These places may not yet be villages in the later agricultural sense, but they are no longer simple passing camps either. They suggest people returning with intention, perhaps staying longer, perhaps gathering in larger groups at times of abundance or danger. Scholars still debate how to interpret each site because preservation, excavation history, and local ecology can all distort the picture. Still, the pattern points toward a world in which some places become anchors while others are left behind. Movement also appears in bodies. Ancient DNA, where it survives, reveals migrations, population bottlenecks, mixing between groups, and the expansion or decline of lineages. This evidence has transformed the study of prehistory, though it must be handled carefully. Genes do not speak in simple stories. A genetic shift in a region may reflect large movement, small elite movement, repeated intermarriage population replacement, or the disappearance of one group's descendants from the sampled record. Ancient DNA is also unevenly preserved, especially in warm or wet climates. Even so, it shows that prehistoric humanity is not static. People move, meet, merge, and sometimes vanish as distinct populations. In a world of unstable climate, such movement is not surprising. It is survival written in ancestry. A lesser-known sign of crisis is the changing size and organization of sites. When resources are predictable and widely spread, small mobile groups can operate across large territories. When resources become patchy, people may cluster near dependable places. That clustering can create both safety and strain. More hands can build shelters, process food, defend stores, care for children, and share knowledge. But more mouths also mean faster depletion, more waste, more disease risk, more social tension, and sharper rules about access. A lakeside camp rich in fish and birds may become a refuge, but a refuge can also become crowded. The archaeological record may show this in thicker deposits, more intensive food processing, and greater investment in structures or storage. Beneath the practical changes lies a social one. People are learning how to live closer together. Abandoned sites are just as important as occupied ones. An empty cave layer, a vanished tool tradition, a break in local occupation, or a sudden reduction in animal remains can suggest that people left or changed their use of a place. Yet emptiness is difficult evidence. A site may disappear from the record because people moved a short distance, because later erosion removed traces, because rising seas drowned the evidence, or because archaeologists have not found the right places. No single abandoned camp proves disaster, but many shifts across a region aligned with climate records, animal changes, and new technologies begin to form a map of pressure. The crisis becomes visible not through one dramatic ruin, but through many small departures. Those departures may have carried emotional weight that no artifact fully preserves. A group leaving a known landscape is not merely changing a dress. It may be leaving burial places, painted shelters, named hills, water sources tied to stories and paths learned in childhood. The decision to move can fracture memory. Some knowledge becomes useless in the new place. Some rituals may lose their landscape. Some elders may carry authority based on routes the young can no longer safely follow. What survives in the record suggests adaptation, but adaptation should not be mistaken for ease. Human flexibility is often praised from a distance because the pain of becoming flexible has disappeared from view. As groups move, they encounter other groups. This is one of the most important consequences of environmental crisis. Contact can bring exchange, marriage shared, hunting, new tools and new ideas. It can also bring conflict, exclusion, violence and competition over water animals, stone sources or shelter. The archaeological signs are subtle and contested trauma on bones, fortified positions in later periods, shifts in weaponry, clustered settlements, or the sudden spread of styles. It would be too simple to imagine a world of constant warfare, just as it would be too gentle to imagine universal cooperation. Disaster narrows choices, and narrowed choices make relationships matter more. People survive not only by finding food, but by negotiating with other humans who need the same world. The first crisis maps therefore show a humanity in motion but not lost. The movement is strategic, experimental, and uneven. Some communities follow animals into new ranges. Some retreat to coasts and rivers. Some intensify plant gathering. Some broaden exchange networks. Some settle more deeply into productive places. Some disappear from the record, absorbed into others, or erased by conditions too harsh to endure. The disaster does not produce one human response. It reveals the range of human possibility under pressure. By the time these scattered traces are gathered together, a new image emerges. Across the ancient world, people are no longer living entirely inside inherited roots. They are redrawing them. Not with ink, not with borders, not with the authority of kings, but with footsteps, fires, burials, tools, marriages, hunger, and hope. The ground remembers where they paused, where they worked, where they returned, and where they did not come back. In those broken maps, the new age begins to take shape. When the old patterns begin to fail, survival becomes a craft of small decisions. It is easy to imagine adaptation as one grand invention, a single breakthrough that rescues a people from hunger and carries them into a new age. The truth is quieter and more demanding. A sharper edge, a better shelter, a new way to bind wood and stone, a hearth protected from wet wind, a pit lined carefully enough to keep food from spoiling a needle, strong enough to close warm clothing, a grinding stone used until its surface becomes smooth with labour. These are not minor details in a collapsing world. They are the difference between endurance and disappearance. Fire remains the oldest centre of this struggle. Long before the crisis, humans know fire intimately, but disaster changes what fire must do. It is warmth when seasons turn unreliable protection, when people are forced into unfamiliar places, a tool for cooking foods that would otherwise be hard to digest, a means of drying meat, fish root seeds, and hides. In cold or damp conditions, keeping embers alive becomes an act of planning. In treeless landscapes, fuel is not always simple, wood gathered at leisure. Dung-bone shrubs, driftwood, peat-like material, and carefully collected branches may all matter. A hearth is not only a source of heat, it is a fixed point around which time is organized. People gather repair tools, process food, watch children treat injuries and carry memory through darkness. Stone too becomes more than a raw material. Toolmakers already possess deep knowledge of fracture, angle, pressure, and patience. A good core of flint or chert can be transformed into blades, scrapers, points, burins, and flakes with planned precision. Under pressure, that knowledge becomes more flexible. If large game grows less dependable, tools must serve more varied tasks. Scrapers prepare hides for clothing and shelter. Fine blades cut plants, meat, sinew, and wood. Points attach to shafts for hunting different animals. Microliths, small stone inserts set into wood or bone, become especially important in some regions because they allow composite tools to be repaired efficiently. Instead of replacing an entire weapon, a broken piece can be removed and another inserted. In a world where travel is costly and stone sources may be distant, repairability is a quiet form of resilience. Composite technology marks one of the great human advantages. A spear, arrow, sickle-like cutting tool or harpoon is not one object, but a relationship among materials: wood, stone, bone, antler, sinew, resin, plant fibre, and human design. Each part has to be chosen, shaped, fitted, and maintained. Adhesives made from resin or other substances require controlled heating and experience. Bindings must hold under stress. Points must be sharp but not too fragile. Shafts must be straight enough to fly or thrust properly. Such tools reveal not only intelligence but a capacity to imagine a finished object before it exists. They also reveal cooperation because knowledge of materials often belongs to many hands and many generations. Shelter becomes another frontier of adaptation. A cave may offer protection, but caves are not everywhere, and not all are safe or conveniently placed near food and water. Open-air shelters can be built from wood, bone, hide, brush, reed, turf, stone, or combinations of local materials. Some are light and temporary, made for movement. Others are more substantial, suggesting repeated use or longer stays. In a stable world, a quick shelter may be enough. In an unstable one, people need structures that can endure harsher weather, protect stored food, and hold a group in place for weeks or months. Post holes, hearth placements, floors, and rebuilt surfaces are faint remains, but they show an important shift. People are not simply passing through the landscape. In some places, they are beginning to reshape it around themselves. Clothing may be one of the most underrated technologies of the human past. It rarely preserves, so its importance can disappear from imagination. But without fitted clothing, many cold environments would be impossible to occupy. Needles made from bone awl scrapers, hide-working tools, and traces of wear on artifacts suggest a world of sewing, cutting, softening, piercing, and repair. Clothing allows movement through cold, wet, windy, or insect-heavy landscapes. It protects children. It carries identity through decoration beads, pigments, shells, teeth, and stitched patterns. It also requires labor. Hides must be obtained, cleaned, stretched, softened, smoked, sewn, and maintained. In times of animal scarcity, the loss of hides may matter almost as much as the loss of meat. Survival depends on the entire animal economy, not only the meal. Food technology grows more complex as diets broaden. Seeds, nuts, roots, and tough plant parts often demand grinding, pounding, soaking, roasting, or leaching before they become reliable nourishment. Grinding stones are humble objects, but they represent a major change in labor and time. A group that invests in heavy grinding equipment may be returning to the same place often enough to justify leaving tools behind or staying long enough to use them repeatedly. Fish traps, nets, hooks, barbed points, baskets, and drying racks may not always survive, but indirect evidence shows increasing attention to aquatic and small resource economies in many regions. This is not a fall from noble hunting into desperate gathering. It is an expansion of skill. The menu becomes wider because the world demands wider knowledge. Storage is perhaps the most consequential invention under pressure. To store food is to argue with time. It means accepting that abundance today must serve hunger later. It requires containers, pits, drying methods, protection from damp and animals, and social rules about who owns or shares what has been saved. Storage can reduce risk, but it can also create new problems. Stored food can be stolen. It can rot. It can attract pests. It can make people less mobile, tying them to places and to the defense of accumulated goods. Scholars still debate how early and how widely intensive storage appears in different regions, but where it does appear, it marks a profound shift. The future is no longer something only approached by movement. It becomes something prepared for in place. There is a lesser-known tension inside all these adaptations. Every useful invention can create dependence. Better shelters make staying easier, but staying can increase pressure on nearby resources. Storage protects against hunger, but it makes movement harder. Specialized tools improve success, but they may require materials not found everywhere. Broader diets reduce reliance on one prey species, but they can demand more labor from more people. The new age is not simply progress unfolding in a straight line. It is a web of trade-offs. Human communities survive by solving one problem, then learning to live with the problems created by the solution. Still, the cumulative effect is extraordinary. Fire becomes more carefully managed, stone becomes more efficient, shelter becomes more durable, Clothing becomes more essential, food processing becomes more intensive, storage becomes more meaningful. These changes do not appear everywhere at once, and they do not always lead to farming or settlement. Many mobile communities remain highly successful for thousands of years. The evidence remains incomplete and no single path defines humanity. Yet across many landscapes under stress, a pattern can be felt. People are drawing survival closer to the body, closer to the hearth, closer to the camp, closer to repeated places. They are no longer trusting the world to provide in the old way. They are building buffers against uncertainty. In the glow of those ancient fires, the new age is not yet visible as villages, temples, fields, or walls. It is visible as hands at work, a blade being retouched, a hide being scraped, seeds being pounded, fish being dried, a shelter being repaired before weather turns. A child learning which plant can be eaten only after careful preparation. An elder remembering a route that no longer works while someone younger tests another way. Disaster has not made humanity stronger in any simple or romantic sense. It has made survival more complicated, and in that complication human life begins to gather new forms, one tool, one hearth, one stored meal at a time. A settlement begins before anyone knows it is a settlement. It begins as a good place to return, a bend in a river where fish gather, a spring that does not fail in the dry season, a slope where wild grains grow thick after winter rain, a lake margin alive with birds, reeds, shellfish and small animals, a sheltered terrace above floodwater, a place where stone, wood, water and food all lie close enough to make staying less dangerous than moving. At first, people may come for a season. Then they come again. Hearths are rebuilt over older hearths. Refuse gathers in thicker layers. Tools are left behind because they will be useful when the group returns. Children learn the shape of a place not as a passing camp but as a familiar world. This is one of the most important shifts in human history, and also one of the easiest to misunderstand. The birth of new settlements does not mean everyone suddenly abandons mobility. Many communities continue to move, and many settled or semi-settled places remain tied to seasonal travel. The line between camp and village is blurred for a long time. A group may spend part of the year in one substantial location and disperse when other resources become available. It may gather with other groups for harvest, ritual exchange, marriage, or defense, then separate again. What changes is not simply architecture. It is attachment. Certain places begin to hold more labor, more memory, more stored food, more dead, and more expectation. Environmental pressure helps explain why this matters. When the wider landscape becomes unpredictable, dependable resource zones become magnets. A spring-fed basin, a wetland, a river crossing or a rich coastal edge can support repeated occupation, even when surrounding territories fail. People do not settle because they become lazy or unimaginative. They settle in part because staying near reliable abundance can become wiser than chasing uncertainty across a changing world. Yet scholars still debate the balance between pressure and opportunity. Some early settlements arise in landscapes that are not simply desperate, but unusually rich. Abundance can gather people just as powerfully as scarcity can. The disaster does not force settlement everywhere by crushing all alternatives. It changes the value of places that can buffer risk. At such places, daily life thickens. Hearths multiply. Work areas become more distinct. Stone tools are made and repaired in familiar spots. Animal bones, shells, seeds, charcoal, broken tools, and ash accumulate. Shelters may be rebuilt along similar lines, suggesting continuity from one occupation to the next. Storage pits appear in some regions, and with them comes a new relationship to the future. Heavy grinding stones may remain in place too cumbersome to carry, but valuable enough to preserve. Burials near or within occupied areas can deepen the sense that a place belongs not only to the living, but to those who came before. What survives in the records suggests that settlement is not merely an economic change, it is social, emotional, and perhaps spiritual. Living closer together creates new possibilities. More people can cooperate in large tasks, building shelters, processing food, caring for children, maintaining fires, watching stored supplies, preparing hides, making tools, and organizing seasonal hunts or harvests. Knowledge can circulate more quickly when families remain near one another. A child can learn from many adults. Specialists may begin to spend more time refining particular skills, though true specialization in the later urban sense remains far away. Exchange can intensify as people from different areas visit reliable gathering places. Shells pigment stone ornaments, and ideas travel along human networks that become denser as certain locations grow important. A settlement is not an isolated dot. It is often a knot in a wider web, but closeness has a darker side. More people in one place means waste accumulates. Food scraps attract animals. Water can become fouled. Disease risks increase, especially where humans, dogs, wild animals, stored food, insects, and refuse overlap. Social tensions sharpen because people see one another more often and compete over the same immediate resources. Rules become more necessary. Who may use the best hearth? Who controls stored food? Who has the right to cut grain from a certain patch, gather reeds from a marsh, or hunt near the settlement? These questions may not leave direct evidence, but they must have existed in some form. A more settled life creates community, and community creates negotiation. Territory also becomes more meaningful. A mobile group can avoid conflict by moving away at least when land is open and resources are spread widely. A group tied to stored food, built shelters, burial places, and nearby plant stands cannot always leave easily. The place itself becomes valuable because labor has been invested in it. This investment may encourage defense, boundary making, and stronger group identity. Archaeologists must be cautious about reading violence or ownership into every early settlement, but the logic is difficult to escape. When people begin to store, build, and return, they also begin to care who else enters. The landscape is no longer only travelled, it is claimed, remembered, and guarded. A lesser-known detail is that some early settled or semi-settled communities may have existed before full agriculture. This challenges the simple story that farming comes first and villages follow. In certain regions, especially where wild resources are abundant and predictable, people can live in substantial communities while still relying heavily on hunting, gathering, fishing, and wild plant collection. Wild grains, nuts, gazelle, fish, birds, and shellfish can support more permanence when managed through careful timing and labor. This matters because it suggests that the social world of settlement may help prepare the ground for farming rather than merely result from it. People who already return to the same place, process large amounts of plant food, store supplies, and defend local resources are already practicing habits that make cultivation more imaginable. The emotional character of settlement is harder to recover, but it may be one of its most powerful forces. A repeated camp becomes familiar in a way a temporary stop does not. The shape of a doorway, the smell of smoke trapped in roof material, the worn path to water, the place where tools are kept, the patch of shade where children sit, the burial of a relative nearby. These details tie memory to ground. Once that happens, leaving becomes harder. Disaster may have pushed people toward dependable places, but memory helps hold them there. The settlement becomes a container for identity, Still, these early communities are not miniature versions of later cities. They are vulnerable, experimental, and often temporary by the standards of deep time. A drought can empty them, a flood can bury them, conflict can scatter them, a change in animal migration can reduce their value. A few generations of success do not guarantee permanence. The evidence remains incomplete, and many such places may have disappeared without leaving enough trace to identify. But the archaeological record shows a growing willingness in some regions to invest in place, and that willingness marks a profound shift from the older rhythm of constant movement. The birth of settlements is therefore not a sudden triumph over nature, it is a bargain. People gain stability, storage, cooperation, memory, and richer social networks. In return, they accept crowding disease risk, territorial tension, heavier labour, and dependence on local conditions. They are not escaping uncertainty, they are changing how uncertainty is managed. The disaster that breaks old roots makes this bargain more attractive, perhaps even necessary in some landscapes. Around the hearths of these repeated places, humanity begins to gather itself differently. The New Age is still fragile, still unwritten, still far from kingdoms or walls, but something essential has changed. A place is no longer only where people survive today, it is where they plan to survive again. The first seeds of the New Age do not look like the beginning of civilization. They look like ordinary food gathered by tired hands, small grains shaken into baskets, wild grasses cut with stone edges, nuts carried back to camp, roots dug from damp soil, seeds spread near a shelter by accident, by waste, by habit, or by intention, so slight that no one would later recognize it as the beginning of a revolution. Farming does not arrive as a single discovery, it creeps forward through attention. People notice where useful plants grow thickest, which patches return after disturbance, which seeds survive storage, which grasses are easier to harvest, which plants appear near camps where people have dropped or processed them. Long before fields exist, the human eye begins to study plants with a new kind of hunger. In a broken world, plants offer something animals increasingly cannot: the possibility of staying close. Herds move beyond control. Fish runs shift. Drought empties basins. But certain plants, if protected, encouraged, harvested at the right time, and stored carefully, can become a more dependable bridge across uncertainty. This does not mean early cultivation begins everywhere as a desperate act. In many regions, it emerges in landscapes of opportunity, where wild cereals, legumes, tubers, or other useful species are already abundant. Yet environmental stress changes the value of these resources. A wild grain stand that once supplements the hunt may become central when animals grow unreliable. A patch of useful plants near a settlement may become worth defending. A seed carried from one place to another may become a small experiment in making the landscape more predictable. The road to farming is long because plants do not become domesticated simply because people eat them. Domestication requires repeated interaction across generations. Humans harvest, select, disturb, soil transport seeds, remove competitors, water or protect certain patches, and favor plants with traits useful to human needs. Over time, some plants begin to change genetically and physically. Seed heads may become less likely to shatter, naturally making harvest easier. Grains may grow larger. Plants may become more dependent on human planting. These changes are not instant, and for long stretches people may cultivate plants that are not yet fully domesticated. The evidence remains incomplete because the earliest phases can be archaeologically subtle. A handful of charred seeds, a grinding stone, a sickle blade with gloss from cutting grasses, a storage pit or pollen shifts may hint at behavior that was still experimental. This is one reason the old phrase agricultural revolution can be misleading. Revolution suggests speed. In reality, the transformation often takes centuries or millennia. People hunt, gather fish, and cultivate at the same time. They may plant some foods while still relying heavily on wild resources. They may abandon cultivation when climate worsens or when mobility becomes useful again. They may return to it later. Farming is not a straight road from ignorance to progress. It is a difficult compromise, and at first it may even make life harder. Cultivated foods can require heavy labor, seasonal risks, storage problems, and vulnerability to drought pests, disease, or raids. A field ties people to a place. It also ties them to a calendar that can fail. Yet the pressure of disaster makes the compromise more understandable. When seasons become unreliable, storing grain has obvious value. When many people gather near a rich settlement, wild resources can be depleted more quickly, making managed plants attractive. When territories shrink or become contested, producing more food near home becomes powerful. When children, elders, and the dead tie a community to one-place movement, becomes socially harder, not only physically harder. In such a world, plants are not merely gathered. They become partners in a new survival system. The relationship is unequal and practical, but it reshapes both sides. Humans change the plants, and the plants change humans. The labor of plant management is quiet but immense. Fields, even early ones, demand clearing, cutting, digging, weeding, carrying, drying, threshing, grinding, cooking, and guarding. Much of this work may have fallen heavily on parts of the community that later histories often overlook, including women, children, elders, and skilled gatherers, whose botanical knowledge was essential. No written record identifies the first person who noticed that a certain grain patch returned better after disturbance, or that stored seeds from one plant produced more useful offspring. The names are lost, but the intelligence is visible. The birth of farming is not the story of one heroic inventor. It is the accumulated work of countless observers, processors, carriers, cooks, experimenters, and memory keepers. A surprising detail is that early plant use may have included foods that later agriculture left behind. Before a few major crops came to dominate, people experimented with many local species, small seeds, wild legumes, fruits, nuts, tubers, reeds, grasses, and plants useful for fiber medicine baskets, mats, and fuel. The prehistoric pantry was often more diverse than later farming systems. This diversity helped manage risk. If one food failed, another might survive. But as cultivation intensified, certain crops became favored, and dependence narrowed. That narrowing could produce more calories, but it also made communities vulnerable in new ways. The New Age did not remove danger, it reorganized it. Grinding stones tell part of this story with unusual intimacy. Their surfaces are worn by repetition, by the pressure of hands turning hard seeds into flour or meal. They suggest not only diet, but posture time and routine. A person kneels or sits, pushes stone against stone, breathes. Dust repeats the motion until food becomes usable. This kind of work rarely appears in grand narratives of human history, yet without it, settlement and farming cannot endure. Bread, porridge, gruel, cooked mash, and stored meal are humble foundations of a different world. The sound of grinding may be one of the earliest background rhythms of settled life. As plant management grows, people become more aware of land as something that can be improved. This is a profound shift. A wild landscape is still powerful, unpredictable, and sacred in ways modern categories may not capture, but humans begin to intervene more deliberately. They clear patches, they burn vegetation, they protect useful stands, they bring seeds closer to home. They create disturbed soils where certain plants thrive. They notice the relationship between human action and plant response. Over generations, this attention becomes tradition. Children learn not only where food grows but how to make it more likely to grow there again. Still, scholars continue to debate why farming begins where it does and when it does. Climate change matters, but it is not enough by itself. Population pressure may matter in some regions. Rich wild resources may encourage settlement, which then encourages cultivation. Social competition, feasting ritual obligations, and the desire to produce surplus may also play roles. No single explanation fully accounts for the many paths into agriculture. Some societies adopt it, others reject it, others mix it with older ways for long periods. The disaster opens a door, but people choose different ways through it. By the time seeds become central to survival, humanity has crossed a threshold that cannot easily be uncrossed. Food is no longer only found, it is planned. The future is no longer only followed through animal tracks and seasonal paths. It is buried in soil, sealed in storage, watched under uncertain skies. From broken roots, unstable weather, and crowded refuges comes a new intimacy with plants. The world has wounded the old human calendar, and in response people begin writing another one into the ground. It is slow, fragile, and full of risk, but it carries within it the first outlines of villages, harvests, property, surplus, hierarchy, and famine. The seed is small. The consequences are enormous. When the sky becomes unreliable, people do not only change their tools, they change the way they search for meaning. A failed season can be survived with stored food if stored food exists. A vanished herd can be answered with new hunting grounds if new grounds can be found. But when the pattern of the world itself seems disturbed, practical skill may not be enough to quiet the mind. The same people who sharpen stone-scrape hides, cut reeds, grind seeds, and repair shelters also live inside a universe filled with signs. The movement of animals, the return of stars, the shape of mountains, the behavior of rivers, the fertility of plants, the presence of ancestors, and the sudden violence of weather, all belong to a world that is not merely used but interpreted. Disaster gives interpretation urgency. If a flood tears through a valley, if ash falls from a distant eruption, if cold returns after warmth, if a lake shrinks year after year, people must decide not only how to survive but how to remember. Human beings are not content to experience terror as random noise. They bind it into story, ritual, place, and repeated action. The evidence remains incomplete because belief rarely fossilizes clearly. Archaeologists find burials, pigments, carved objects, arranged stones, unusual deposits, decorated tools, animal remains placed in careful ways and structures that seem to hold more than practical function. What those things meant to the people who made them is often debated. Still, the pattern suggests that as material life changes, symbolic life changes with it. Death is one of the clearest places where this can be seen. Burials become anchors of memory, especially when people return to the same places again and again. A body placed near a shelter under a floor beside a settlement or within a special landscape creates a relationship between the living and the ground. The dead are no longer only left behind on the route, they can become part of the place itself. This does not mean every burial has the same meaning, or that all communities think about ancestors in the same way. Scholars still debate the meanings of many prehistoric mortuary practices, but the act of burying, arranging, ornamenting, or revisiting the dead suggests that memory is being fixed more strongly into landscape. In unsettled times, that bond may matter deeply. Ritual also gathers around animals. Even as key animal populations decline or shift, animals continue to dominate human imagination. They are represented, selected, deposited, worn as ornaments, shaped into tools, and possibly honoured in ceremonies now lost. A skull placed carefully, antlers arranged in a structure, bones treated differently from ordinary food waste or repeated attention to certain species may suggest meanings beyond consumption. Caution is necessary because modern observers can easily overinterpret a fragment. A bone may be ritual, practical, accidental, or all three. Yet it is difficult to believe that animals so central to food, danger, clothing, and story held no sacred weight. When the living roots of animals changed, the symbolic roots may have become even more important. The sky offers another kind of order. Long before formal astronomy, people watch the heavens because the heavens move with a rhythm that seems more dependable than weather. Stars return. The moon changes and comes back. The sun shifts along the horizon. Certain celestial patterns can help mark seasons, guide travel, and structure gathering times. It would be misleading to claim that every ancient monument or stone arrangement was an observatory. Many popular claims go far beyond the evidence. But it is equally misleading to imagine prehistoric people as indifferent to the sky. In a world where seasons misbehave, the more regular cycles above may become powerful tools for thought timing and ceremony. Some early monumental or semi-monumental places appear before full agricultural civilization, and they complicate the old assumption that only surplus farming societies can create sacred architecture. At certain sites, people who still depend heavily on wild resources gather to build, carve, arrange stones or shape special spaces. These places may be connected with feasting memory, death animals, identity, or seasonal assembly. The exact meanings remain debated, and no single interpretation can explain all of them. Yet their existence shows that communities under transformation are capable of organizing labor for purposes that exceed immediate survival. Disaster and uncertainty do not reduce human life to food alone. They may intensify the need for shared meaning. A lesser-known detail is that ritual can help solve practical problems without being merely practical. When larger groups gather near rich resource zones or early settlements, they need ways to cooperate, reduce conflict, define belonging, and remember obligations. Ceremony, shared burial practices, feasts, symbolic objects, and sacred places can bind people who are not all close kin. They can make exchange safer. They can turn seasonal meetings into predictable events. They can give authority to rules about land, food, marriage, hunting, or storage. This does not make ritual a disguise for economics. It means belief and survival are intertwined. A community's sense of the sacred can be one of its technologies of endurance. Feasting may have played a special role in this changing world. A feast is more than a large meal. It gathers people, displays generosity, creates debt, strengthens alliances, and marks important times. In a world where food is uncertain, the ability to feed others becomes socially powerful. Wild grains, hunted animals, fish, gathered nuts, fermented foods in later contexts, and stored supplies can all become part of communal events. Archaeological evidence for feasting can be difficult to prove, but unusually large concentrations of animal bones, special serving vessels in later periods, large hearths, or repeated gathering places may point in that direction. If early cultivation helps support feasts, then ritual may even help encourage the production of more food than a household immediately needs. Fear of the unstable sky may also leave traces in the way landscapes are chosen. High places, springs, caves, river sources, unusual stones, old trees, cliffs, and places where animals gather often attract human attention. Such locations already stand out in memory. Under stress, they may become even more charged. A spring that never fails during drought can become not just useful but revered. A cave that shelters generations can become a womb of memory. A hill where the sun appears at a particular time may become a marker of return. The line between practical and sacred is a modern convenience. In ancient life, the useful place may also be the holy place because usefulness itself can feel like gift power and mystery. None of this means disaster invents belief. Symbolic behavior is far older. Art ornaments, pigments, careful burials, and other expressions of meaning long predate the age of settlement and farming. The human mind has already been making worlds beyond immediate hunger for tens of thousands of years. What changes here is intensity and context. As people settle, more often, store more food, manage plants, and gather in larger communities, ritual practices may become more anchored, more public, and more tied to place. Memory begins to accumulate in the ground. The sacred becomes less only a path through the landscape, and more a center to which people return. This transformation has consequences. Once a place holds the dead, the stories, the ceremonies, and the stored food leaving it becomes more complicated. A settlement is no longer just convenient, it becomes meaningful. A field is not only soil, it may be inheritance. A spring is not only water, it may be protection. A monument is not only stone, it may be a claim that the community belongs here even when the world remains dangerous. In this way, ritual strengthens the very changes that disaster has begun to encourage. It ties people to place, binds groups together, and gives shape to fear. Under the unstable sky, ancient people do not simply wait for explanation. They create forms that can hold uncertainty. They bury, gather, carve, feast, remember, watch, and return. Their ceremonies do not stop the drought, raise the drowned coast, or call vanished herds back from absence, but they make a shaken world speakable. They turn terror into pattern loss, into memory and survival, into something larger than endurance. The New Age is being built not only from firestone shelter and seeds, but from the deep human need to believe that even disaster has a place in the order of things. The earth keeps records no human witness intended to leave. It writes in ash pollen, mud, ice, bone, charcoal, shell, and stone. Long after the voices of the people are gone, long after their shelters collapse and their paths are drowned, the ground still holds the faint grammar of the disaster. A dark band in a cave floor marks repeated fires. A pale volcanic layer spreads across a region like a date stamped by catastrophe. Lake mud preserves pollen from plants that once grew nearby, then records their disappearance when climate shifts. Bones reveal which animals were hunted, which were butchered, which vanished from the menu. Seeds burned by accident and saved by carbon show what people gathered, stored, cooked, or began to cultivate. The New Age is not reconstructed from memory, it is reconstructed from debris. This evidence is powerful, but it is never simple. Archaeology does not uncover the past as a finished story waiting under soil. It uncovers fragments, and each fragment has to be placed into relation with many others. A stone tool can show skill, but not always why it was made. A storage pit can show planning, but not whether the food was owned by a family, shared by a group, guarded by ritual, or abandoned after disaster. A layer of ash can identify an eruption, but not always how the people nearby understood it, or how many seasons of hardship followed. The evidence remains incomplete, and every confident reconstruction must live beside uncertainty. The past is real, but it reaches the present through damage. Lake cores are among the quietest witnesses. A cylinder of mud drawn from the bottom of an ancient lake can contain a layered history of vegetation dust, fire, erosion, and climate. Pollen grains trapped in sediment reveal the plants growing in the surrounding landscape. When grass pollen declines and tree pollen increases, a steppe may be giving way to woodland. When drought-tolerant plants rise, the lake's world may be drying. Charcoal particles suggest fire, though whether those fires are natural, human-made, or both can be difficult to determine. diatoms and chemical signals can hint at water depth, salinity, and temperature. In these slow deposits, the broken seasons of ancient life become measurable. Ice cores tell another part of the story from colder regions. Their layers can hold traces of volcanic sulfate dust, greenhouse gases, and abrupt climate shifts. They show that the atmosphere has changed suddenly before, and that events in one part of the planet can leave signals far away. A major eruption may appear as chemical evidence in ice even when the volcano itself lies across the world. Yet connecting such signals directly to human decisions is difficult. A cold pulse recorded in ice may coincide with changes at archaeological sites, but coincidence is not automatic proof. No single explanation fully accounts for human transformation. The skill lies in comparing many records and asking whether they point in the same direction. Caves and rock shelters offer more intimate archives. Their protected spaces can preserve hearths, tools, animal bones, pigments, ornaments, and layers of occupation over long periods. A cave may show a community returning across generations then stopping. It may show changes in diet technology or intensity of use. It may preserve the bones of animals no longer found in the region, revealing how the living world around the shelter changed. But caves also distort the picture because they attract preservation. Places where open-air camps once stood may have left fewer traces, especially if later rivers' roots ploughing erosion or rising seas destroyed them. The ancient world was not lived only in caves, even if caves often speak loudest. Coastal evidence is even more elusive. Some of the most important prehistoric landscapes are now underwater. During periods of lower sea level, coastlines extended far beyond their present positions. Rivers crossed plains that are now continental shelf. People likely lived, gathered, fished, buried, and travelled across places that later vanished beneath rising seas. This means the archaeological record may be missing whole chapters of human adaptation. Shell middens, submerged forests, drowned river channels, and underwater sites offer glimpses, but only glimpses. The sea is an archive, but it is a harsh one. It preserves some things under sediment and destroys others completely. What survives in the record suggests that the loss of ancient coasts may have erased many of the places where the New Age first gathered strength. Bones carry a different testimony. Animal remains can reveal diet, hunting choices, season of occupation, butchery methods, and ecological change. Cut marks show where stone tools sliced flesh or separated joints. Burn patterns show cooking or disposal. Age profiles of prey can suggest hunting strategies. If many young animals appear, it may indicate herd vulnerability or selective killing. If fish bones and small game increase, people may be broadening their diet. Human bones, when preserved and ethically studied, can show injuries, nutrition, mobility disease, and sometimes genetic ancestry. Teeth can hold chemical signatures of diet and place, yet bodies must be read with care. Each individual lived a full human life, not merely a data point in a theory of collapse. Plant remains are especially important because they show the quiet shift towards storage and cultivation. Charred seeds survive where unburned ones decay. Phytoliths, tiny mineral bodies formed in plants, can sometimes persist after the plant itself is gone. Starch grains trapped on tools may reveal processing of roots or seeds. Use wear on stone blades can show cutting grasses. Grinding stones preserve traces of repeated plant processing. Together, these clues reveal a widening world of food. They show people paying more attention to plants long before fields become obvious. The transformation from gathering to cultivation leaves no single dramatic boundary. It appears as small signals accumulating over time. A surprising detail is how much modern science depends on accidents of ancient destruction. Fire destroys, but it also preserves seeds by charring them. Ash buries landscapes, but it also seals them. Floods erase camps, but sometimes trap objects in protective mud. A collapsed roof can crush a household and preserve its floor. Catastrophe can become conservation. Without these accidents, whole ways of life would be almost invisible. The same disasters that threatened ancient communities sometimes protect the evidence by which they are known. But evidence can also tempt the imagination too far. A dramatic layer, a sudden abandonment, or an unusual concentration of bones can invite a neat story. One eruption caused everything, one flood created. Farming, one drought forced settlement, one impact changed human destiny. These stories are attractive because they give the past the shape of a single event. Mainstream research is usually more cautious. The record tends to show uneven changes across regions, with different causes interacting. Climate pressure, human choice, animal decline, technological innovation, population movement, social gathering, and local opportunity all overlap. The disaster matters, but it is not always a hammer striking a passive humanity. It is a shifting field of pressure in which people act. The physical record therefore teaches humility. It confirms that ancient environments change sharply. It shows that people moved, adapted, gathered, stored, processed, and eventually cultivated in new ways. It reveals that animals vanished from old worlds, that plants changed their ranges, that fires burned, that rivers and coasts transformed, that bodies carried stress, and that settlements thickened in certain places. But it cannot recover every decision. It cannot fully restore the fear of a failed spring, the grief of leaving a burial place, the argument over whether to move the first careful scattering of seeds near camp, or the awe of ash falling from a sky no one could explain. Still, from these buried traces, a story rises with unusual force. Earth remembers what people could not write. It remembers the unstable sky in chemical layers, the changed forests in pollen, the missing herds in bones, the new foods in charred seeds, the repeated hearths in ash, the gathering communities in thickened floors. The disaster that forced humanity into a new age is not preserved as one monument. It is preserved as a pattern running through many kinds of evidence. Each clue is partial. Together they show a world under pressure, and a species learning painfully how to become something different. The deeper the evidence is studied, the less satisfying a single explanation becomes. It is tempting to imagine one great disaster standing behind the entire transformation, one eruption, one flood, one cold snap, one drought, one cosmic impact, one event so dramatic that everything after it becomes easy to explain. Such stories have power because they make history feel clean. They give the ancient world a before and an after. They turn scattered evidence into a sharp line. But the earth rarely changes human life so neatly, and human communities rarely respond in one way. The disaster that forced humanity into a new age is better understood as a cluster of pressures, overlapping across regions, each one severe enough to matter, none of them alone able to explain the full story. Mainstream explanations usually begin with climate because climate sits beneath so many other changes. At the end of the Ice Age, warming, cooling reversals, shifting rainfall, melting ice, rising seas, changing vegetation, and unstable rivers reshape the basic conditions of life. Climate changes where animals can live, where plants can grow, where water gathers, where people can travel, and where settlement becomes possible. It does not have to kill directly to transform history. It only has to alter the relationship between effort and reward. A hunting route that once fed a group becomes less reliable. A wild grain zone becomes more valuable. A shoreline rich in food disappears beneath the sea. A dry valley pushes people toward the few places where water remains. In this view, the New Age grows from environmental instability acting over many generations. Yet climate alone is too broad to explain everything. Similar climate pressure can produce different human responses. Some groups become more mobile, not less. Some intensify gathering without farming. Some settle early while still relying heavily on wild foods. Some adopt cultivation and later abandon it. Some communities remain successful hunters and gatherers for thousands of years after farming appears elsewhere. This variation matters because it reminds us that humans are not passive creatures shaped by weather like clay. They make choices within limits. They carry traditions, preferences, social rules, spiritual beliefs, technologies, and memories. A drought may create pressure, but it does not automatically create agriculture. It creates a problem, and people solve that problem differently depending on what their world offers. Another explanation emphasizes population. As human groups spread and numbers increase in certain favorable regions, pressure on wild resources may grow. A landscape that can feed scattered bands comfortably may struggle when more families return to the same places more often. Rich wetlands, grain fields, river valleys, and coasts can attract people precisely because they are productive, but gathering around abundance can create density. Density can encourage storage, territoriality, cultivation, and more formal cooperation. It can also increase conflict and disease. In this view, the New Age emerges not only because nature becomes unstable, but because humans themselves become a larger ecological force. The evidence remains incomplete, but site density, resource intensification, and settlement growth suggest that population pressure may have mattered in some regions. A related explanation focuses on opportunity rather than crisis. Farming and settlement may begin where wild resources are abundant enough to allow people to experiment and organize labor. In this view, the first steps toward the New Age are not born from starvation, but from unusually rich environments where humans can invest time in storage, ritual construction, and plant management. This is an important correction to overly bleak disaster stories. People do not invent settled life only because they are desperate. They may also do it because certain landscapes offer a remarkable combination of grain, water, animals, stone, wood, and seasonal predictability. But opportunity and crisis are not opposites. A rich place becomes even more important when surrounding regions grow less reliable. Disaster can sharpen the value of abundance. Some scholars emphasize social and symbolic forces. As groups gather in larger numbers, they need ways to build trust, display generosity, mark belonging, and manage competition. Feasts, rituals, sacred places, burial grounds, and monuments may help bind communities together. Producing surplus food can become socially valuable, not only because it prevents hunger, but because it allows people to host gatherings, honor ancestors, create alliances, or compete for prestige. In this view, the road toward farming may be partly driven by the demands of social life. People cultivate more, not simply to eat more, but to gather more, give more, owe more, and belong more. This does not reduce ritual to economics. It shows that belief, food, and power are already entangled long before kings. Then there are the more dramatic theories, the ones that often capture popular imagination. Some propose that a sudden cosmic impact or airburst helped trigger abrupt cooling, fires, extinctions, and cultural change near the end of the Ice Age. Others point to enormous floods from melting ice sheets or volcanic eruptions that darkened skies and damaged ecosystems. These possibilities should not be dismissed automatically, because sudden events did happen in prehistory, and some were catastrophic on regional or even wider scales. Meltwater floods changed landscapes. Volcanic eruptions left ash and atmospheric signals. Abrupt climate events are real. But the most sweeping versions of single-cause catastrophe theories remain disputed where the evidence is inconsistent, debated, or unable to explain global variation. A dramatic event may be part of the story without being the whole engine of the New Age. The problem with one-cause explanations is that they flatten human diversity. The path into settlement and farming in Southwest Asia is not identical to the path in China, New Guinea, Africa, the Americas, or Europe. Different plants are managed. Different animals are hunted or domesticated. Different climates apply pressure. Different social worlds develop. In some places, rivers and seasonal floods become central. In others, highland valleys, monsoon patterns, tropical forests, drylands, or coastal zones shape the story. The broad movement toward more intensive food production appears in multiple regions, but not as a single invention spreading from one disaster zone to all others. It is a mosaic. That mosaic is what makes the transformation so remarkable. A lesser-known complication is that evidence can appear to support different explanations depending on scale. At a local site, an abrupt abandonment may look like the result of one drought, one flood, or one eruption. At a regional scale, the same abandonment may be part of a broader settlement shift. At a continental scale, it may align with long-term climate change. At a human scale, it may have been caused by a marriage alliance, a conflict, a failed harvest, or the death of key elders. None of these scales is false. They are different layers of the same past. The challenge is not choosing one and discarding the rest, but understanding how they interact. So the most grounded explanation is also the most complex. The New Age emerges from climate instability, ecological change, animal decline, human movement, population pressure, technological flexibility, social gathering, symbolic life, and local opportunity. Disaster is the pressure that exposes weaknesses in older systems, but human creativity determines what happens next. Some communities move. Some cling to refuges, some store, some cultivate, some build, some intensify ritual, some vanish into other populations, some leave traces so faint they can barely be named. The evidence does not reveal a single road. It reveals many roads crossing a broken landscape. This may be less dramatic than blaming one fire in the sky or one flood beneath the moon, but it is more haunting. It means the disaster was not one moment that ancient people endured and then escaped. It was a condition that unfolded through weather, hunger, movement, memory, and experiment. It was the repeated discovery that yesterday's answer might not solve tomorrow's problem. In that long uncertainty, humanity did not simply survive. It reorganized survival itself. The competing explanations do not cancel one another. They gather like layers of sediment into a deeper truth. The New Age was born, because the world changed in many ways at once, and people changed with it. Once the old world has broken its patterns and people have learned to answer uncertainty with storage, settlement, ritual, and experiment, a different human order begins to emerge. It does not arrive with crowns, armies, written laws, or city gates. Those belong to a later horizon. At first, the change is quieter, a fuller hearth, a thicker refuse layer, a better built shelter, a store of grain kept through the hungry season, a burial place close to the living, a path worn deeper between water and home. Yet these small changes alter the architecture of society. They make people more tied to place, more tied to one another, and more tied to the consequences of what they produce, save defend and remember. The first major consequence is scale. A small mobile group can operate through intimacy. Everyone knows the others well. Decisions are shaped by kinship experience, immediate need, and the practical realities of movement. But when people gather in larger and more permanent communities, social life becomes more complicated. More families share space. More relationships must be managed. More disputes can arise over food, labor marriage tools, ritual responsibilities, and access to land. Cooperation becomes more powerful but also more demanding. A village, even an early one, is not merely a cluster of shelters. It is a machine for living together under pressure, and machines require rules. Those rules may not be written, and they may not resemble later government, but they matter. Who may harvest from a particular patch of wild grain? Who watches the stored food? Who repairs the roof of a communal structure? Who decides when a group leaves, stays, plants, hunts, gathers, or gathers others for ceremony? Who has the authority to settle a quarrel? In mobile societies, leadership can be flexible, tied to skill, age, persuasion, or situation. In more settled life, authority may begin to attach more strongly to places, lineages, ritual roles, or control of stored resources. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be wrong to imagine a simple march from equality to hierarchy everywhere. Still, the conditions of inequality begin to take firmer shape when food, land, and memory accumulate. Surplus is central to this change. A stored harvest is protection against hunger, but it's also power waiting in a pit basket bin or sealed room. Food that can be saved can be shared, traded, displayed, stolen, taxed in later worlds, or used to support people who are not gathering food every day. At first, surplus may be modest and fragile, vulnerable to damp pests, theft, and failure. But even modest surplus changes human possibilities. It allows longer ceremonies. It allows feasts. It allows craft work to expand. It allows some people to spend more time making tools, ornaments, baskets, ritual objects, structures, or boats. It allows obligation to grow. The gift of food can create gratitude, but it can also create debt. Trade networks expand in this new order, though exchange is far older than settlement. Shells travel inland. Stone travels away from quarries. Pigments, beads, obsidian, marine materials, animal products, and ideas move across landscapes through meetings, marriages, seasonal gatherings, and long chains of exchange. What changes is the intensity and social value of connection. A more settled community may need materials not found nearby. It may also produce things others want. It may become known as a place with grain, fish, stone, ritual, power, skilled makers, or access to a route. The ancient map of survival becomes overlaid with a map of relationships. The path no longer leads only to food and water. It leads to people. Technology also changes under the weight of this new order. Tools become more specialized because tasks become more repeated. Grinding stones, sickle, blades, axes for clearing, digging sticks, baskets, cordage nets, storage containers, plastered surfaces, and eventually pottery in many regions all belong to a world where processing and keeping food become central. Some of these technologies appear at different times in different places and not always in the same sequence. Pottery, for example, is not simply a farming invention. In some regions, it appears among hunter-gatherers who need containers for cooking, storage, or processing. This is a useful warning against simple stories. The New Age is not one package. It is assembled differently in each landscape. Domesticated animals, where they enter the story, deepen the transformation. The management of animals begins with long familiarity, not sudden domination. People already understand animal behavior intimately. They know movement, breeding seasons, danger signs, feeding preferences, and herd structure. Turning that knowledge into herding requires a new relationship, protecting, confining, selecting, feeding, moving, and eventually breeding animals under human influence. This process does not happen with every species. Most animals are poor candidates for domestication. Those that can be managed begin to draw humans into new routines. Herds need pasture water protection and seasonal movement. They create wealth, that can walk, reproduce, die, be stolen, or mark status. They also bring humans into closer contact with animal diseases, parasites, and waste. A lesser-known consequence of the new order is that life may become harder for many bodies, even as communities become more productive. Early farming and settled life can bring more calories, but often with narrower diets, heavier labour, more infectious disease, and greater vulnerability to crop failure. Skeletal remains in some regions show signs of stress associated with changing diets and workloads, though patterns vary widely. Teeth may suffer from carbohydrate-rich foods. Repetitive grinding, carrying, kneeling, digging, and building leave marks on bones and joints. Children grow up in denser settlements where pathogens can spread more easily. The New Age is not simply an improvement, it is a trade, and not everyone pays the same price. Yet the momentum is powerful. Once a community invests in fields, storage houses, ritual places, and local dead leaving becomes harder. Once population grows around dependable food production, returning fully to older mobility may become difficult. Once neighbours also settle land becomes more contested. Once surplus supports larger gatherings and social obligations, the system begins to reproduce itself. Farming creates the conditions for more farmers. Villages create the need for more village rules. Stored food creates both security and vulnerability. The new order gathers force not because it solves every problem, but because it changes what problems people must solve next. Territoriality sharpens. Boundaries that once may have been flexible become more emotionally and economically charged. A field is not like a passing berry patch. A built house is not like a temporary shelter. A burial ground is not like a camp used once. When people invest labour into land, land becomes history. That history can be defended, inherited, contested, and remembered. Conflict may increase in some regions, though the evidence must be interpreted cautiously. Trauma on skeletons, defensive locations, weapons, and burned settlements from later periods show that settled life can bring violence as well as cooperation. But even without constant warfare, the idea of belonging to a place becomes stronger, and with it comes the possibility of exclusion. This is the uneasy birth of society as later history will recognize it. Not civilization yet, but the groundwork of civilization. Repeated settlement, food production, surplus ritual centers, trade routes, emerging inequality, territorial memory, and larger communities capable of coordinated labor. The disaster did not invent these capacities from nothing. Humans already had language, imagination, skill care, conflict, and cooperation. What changed was the pressure placed on those capacities and the environments in which they operated. The new human order emerges because ancient people use old intelligence to answer new instability, and the answers become structures that outlast the original crisis. By the end of this transformation, the world is no longer organized only by the movement of wild herds and seasonal camps. It is increasingly organized by stored food, fixed places, cultivated plants, managed animals, remembered dead, and social obligations that reach beyond the day's hunt. A person born into this world inherits different expectations from an ancestor who lived entirely by older roots. The future is closer to the ground, now buried in seeds, walls, pits, paths, and promises. Humanity has survived the disaster, but survival has changed its shape. The cost is dependence. The gift is possibility. From this bargain, the long road toward villages, temples, cities, and states begins to open. Long after the water withdraws, the ash settles, the herds fail to return, and the first frightened generation is gone, disaster survives by changing form. It becomes memory. Not memory in the fragile sense of one person recalling a terrible season, but memory carried by communities through repeated telling, sacred places, warnings, rituals, and names attached to land. A floodplain is not merely a floodplain if ancestors once escaped its rising water. A mountain is not merely stone if fire or darkness came from beyond it. A spring is not merely useful if it saved people through drought. A coast is not merely an edge of land if older stories say that the sea once stood farther away, beyond places now lost beneath waves. The past becomes geography. This is one of the most mysterious parts of ancient transformation, because memory rarely preserves itself in a form that can be tested easily. Archaeology can show a drowned shoreline, a burned layer, a shifted settlement, a burial practice, or a repeated return to a sacred place. It cannot always show the story told beside the hearth. Oral traditions can sometimes carry echoes of real environmental events across astonishing spans of time, but they also change with every generation. They gather moral lessons, sacred meaning, family identity, political claims, and poetic exaggeration. Scholars still debate how far back particular memories can be traced, and it is risky to attach any single myth too confidently to any single prehistoric event. Yet it would be equally careless to assume that ancient people simply forgot the disasters that shaped their worlds. A community that survives catastrophe has reasons to remember. Memory teaches where not to camp when rivers become dangerous, which plants return after fire, which springs endure, which coastlines are unstable, which animal movements can no longer be trusted. Practical warnings can be wrapped in story because story travels better than instruction alone. A tale of a land swallowed by water may preserve caution about the sea. A story of a darkened sky may encode terror of eruption, smoke, eclipse, dust, or storm. A tradition about a sacred mountain may preserve the importance of a refuge. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the survival of such memories, but the human need to turn danger into teaching is ancient and powerful. Flood stories are among the most widespread examples, though they must be handled carefully. Rising seas, river floods, glacial outburst, floods, storm surges, tsunamis, and seasonal inundations have affected communities across the world. It is not surprising that many cultures remember destructive water. Water is one of the most common agents of both life and ruin. Some flood traditions may reflect local river behavior. Others may echo sea level rise or catastrophic regional events. Many may be symbolic, moral, cosmological, or shaped by later religious systems. The existence of a flood story does not prove one global flood, and mainstream geology does not support such a claim, but the persistence of flood memory makes sense in a species that repeatedly watched water redraw the map. Fire stories too may carry fragments of deep experience. Volcanic eruptions, wildfires, lightning storms, burning grasslands, and skies darkened by smoke or ash can leave marks on landscape and imagination. A volcano does not need to destroy the whole world to become the center of a people's fear. Ashfall can ruin water and food, lava can remake ground, distant eruptions can dim light and cool seasons. Wildfire can open new plant growth while also destroying shelter animals and stored supplies. In oral memory, these events may become stories of angry mountains, fire from the sky, underground heat, or ancestral beings moving through burning land. Such interpretations are not primitive mistakes. They are ways of placing violent earth inside a meaningful universe. Landscape itself becomes a memory system. A path repeated for generations carries knowledge in the feet. A stone arrangement can mark a gathering place. A burial ground fixes ancestry into soil. A carved surface, painted wall, or unusual deposit can make memory visible. When people become more settled, these anchors grow stronger. Stories are no longer tied only to movement across broad territories. They become attached to particular houses, springs, fields, ridges, and ritual centers. The New Age creates more places where memory can accumulate. A settlement is not only a practical solution to uncertainty, it is a vessel for remembered disaster and survival. There is a subtle transformation here. In older mobile worlds, memory often works through routes: where to go, when to go, how to read changing signs across a wide landscape. In more settled worlds, memory also works through ownership and inheritance: who belongs here, who came first, who is buried here, who has the right to plant harvest store and speak for the place. Disaster memories can become part of these claims. A community that endured drought at a spring may treat that spring as sacred and ancestral. A group that survived flood on high ground may bind identity to that hill. A people who built a ritual center after upheaval may use ceremony to declare continuity in a world that once threatened to erase them. A lesser-known detail is that myths of lost lands may sometimes preserve awareness of real landscape change without functioning as literal history. During the post-Ice Age rise in sea level, enormous areas of habitable land vanished beneath water. River valleys became estuaries, plains became seabed. Islands were cut off, coastal resources moved. People living through this would not have experienced a uniform silent rise. They would have seen storms bite deeper into shorelines, marshes drown familiar paths become tidal flats, and old camps grow unreachable. Over generations, the memory of land beyond the water could become a story of a drowned world. Not every legend of a lost island or sunken kingdom belongs to this deep process, and many popular claims are unsupported. But the underlying human experience is real enough. The sea took places where people once lived. As memory becomes myth, it also becomes more than warning. It becomes identity. A disaster can explain why a people live where they live, why they avoid a valley, why they honor a mountain, why they gather at a certain season, why certain animals matter, why ancestors must be remembered in a particular way. The story gives order to loss. It tells later generations that survival was earned, not accidental. It also creates a moral landscape where places are not neutral, but charged with lessons. Some places are generous, some are dangerous, some demand respect, some should not be disturbed. In this way, ancient environmental knowledge may survive inside ritual behavior long after the original event has blurred beyond recognition. The tragedy is that many memories must have vanished. Languages die, communities merge, settlements are abandoned, sacred places are forgotten or destroyed, coasts drown. Later civilizations build over older ground and rename it. Stories adapt to new religions, new rulers, new anxieties. The memory of a real disaster can become unrecognizable, while another event leaves no story at all. The archaeological record can sometimes recover the physical wound, but not the song-warning gesture or ceremony that once held it. What survives is only a fraction of what was carried. Still, the persistence of disaster memory reveals something essential about the new human age. People do not move from catastrophe into civilization by forgetting fear. They build with fear inside the foundation. The first villages, fields, and sacred places are not monuments to certainty. They're responses to a world that proved it could change without permission. The stories that gather around water-fire darkness, hunger animals, and lost land are part of the same transformation as storage pits and cultivated seeds. They are another form of adaptation, another way of keeping the future from arriving completely unprepared. By the time memory becomes myth and landscape, the disaster has crossed from environment into culture. It no longer exists only in ash layers or pollen records. It lives in the way people speak of the ground beneath them, the hills around them, the waters that feed or threaten them, and the ancestors who survived before them. The New Age inherits not only tools and settlements, but warnings. Beneath the first stable homes lies the knowledge that stability can fail. Beneath the first fields lies the memory of hunger. Beneath the first sacred places lies the old trembling recognition that the world is powerful and humanity survives by remembering where it has already broken. The age inherited from disaster is fragile from the beginning. It carries the marks of human brilliance, but also the marks of compromise. People have learned to stay longer, store more carefully, return to meaningful places, manage plants, gather in larger communities, and wrap fear inside memory. These changes make a different future possible, but they do not free humanity from danger. They create new dangers alongside new strengths. A field can feed more people than a wild patch, but it can fail all at once. A settlement can hold memory tools, children, elders, and stored grain, but it can also concentrate disease waste, conflict, and dependence. A ritual center can unite communities, but it can also sharpen boundaries between those who belong and those who do not. The New Age is not a simple victory over the Old World. It is a new arrangement with uncertainty. This is the great irony at the center of the human story. Disaster pushes people towards stability, and stability creates systems that can be broken by later disasters. The first steps towards settled life are answers to risk, yet they also make certain risks larger. A mobile community can sometimes leave a failing valley with little more than tools, children, and memory. A village with houses, stored food fields, graves, and sacred places cannot move so easily. Its strength is rootedness. Its weakness is rootedness. The same attachment that gives people identity can turn drought, flood, disease, or conflict into a crisis of existence. Once survival is tied to place, the place becomes both refuge and trap. The archaeological record repeatedly shows this tension. Early settlements appear, grow, change, and sometimes vanish. Some are abandoned because water shifts, resources decline, or social arrangements fail. Others are rebuilt again and again, layer upon layer, as if persistence itself becomes a form of resistance. Later villages become towns, and some towns eventually become cities. Fields expand, herds multiply, trade routes lengthen, craft traditions deepen, ritual structures grow more ambitious. Social differences become more visible in houses, burials, objects, and access to goods. None of this happens everywhere at once, and no single path leads from disaster to civilization. Yet the larger pattern is clear. The old crisis helps create a world where human communities can become larger, more productive, more inventive, and more vulnerable at the same time. A surprising detail is that the New Age never fully replaces the old. For thousands of years, farmers, herders, fishers, foragers, hunters, traders, and mobile groups live beside one another, learn from one another, compete with one another, and sometimes become one another. There is no clean border where prehistory stops being mobile and becomes settled. Even in farming worlds, hunting continues. Even in settled worlds, migration remains essential. Even in villages, people remember wild plants, seasonal movements, animal behavior, and distant exchange routes. The older human inheritance does not vanish. It is folded into the new order. Civilization, when it finally emerges, is not the opposite of ancient survival. It is built from it. This matters because the disaster did not make humanity modern in the narrow sense. It did not suddenly produce cities writing mathematics armies or law codes. Those developments come much later, after many more transformations, failures, and recoveries. What it helped produce was a changed relationship with time. People begin to live more intensely in the future. They plant for a harvest not yet visible. They store for a hunger not yet arrived. They build structures meant to be repaired by those who remain. They bury their dead in places the living expect to revisit. They pass on rights, obligations, debts, and warnings. The future becomes something managed, feared, inherited, and defended. The cost of this future-minded life is heavy. Farming can increase food supply, but it can also narrow diet and intensify labour. Settlements can support more children, but they can also expose those children to disease. Surplus can prevent starvation, but it can also create inequality. Territory can protect a community, but it can also invite conflict. Ritual can bind people together, but it can also justify exclusion or authority. The evidence remains incomplete, and every region has its own rhythm, but the broad transformation carries a deep ambiguity. Humanity survives disaster by creating systems of greater control, and those systems become new sources of pressure. No single explanation fully accounts for this inheritance. Climate instability helps push the change. Ecological loss narrows old options. Human creativity opens new ones. Population opportunity, ritual technology, memory, and social ambition all play their parts. The disaster is not one monster standing at the gate of history. It is the force of a changing planet pressing against human life until old habits bend. Yet the human response is not passive. People do not simply submit to climate hunger or ash. They interpret, organize, experiment, argue, remember, and build. The new age is born from that difficult exchange between a restless Earth and a species unwilling to disappear quietly. In the end, the fragile age inherited from that disaster is still recognizable because it is still in many ways our own. Modern life is vastly removed from the first stored seeds and repeated hearths, but it still depends on the same bargain. Communities gather around dependable resources. Food systems promise security while creating dependence. Cities hold memory and risk in the same streets. Technology buffers humanity from nature while tying it to systems that can fail. Societies tell stories about past catastrophes not only to explain what happened, but to prepare for what may happen again. Beneath the distance of millennia, the pattern remains familiar. The ancient disaster forced humanity into a new age because it revealed that survival could not depend only on following the world as it had always been. People had to make new arrangements with uncertainty. They had to bring food closer, bind communities tighter, store memory deeper, and turn dangerous landscapes into lived places filled with meaning. From the outside, this looks like progress. From within, it must have felt like fear, work loss, and stubborn adaptation. The first people who crossed that threshold did not know they were helping create the conditions for civilization. They were trying to keep children alive, keep fires burning, keep food from spoiling, keep stories intact, and keep tomorrow from becoming empty. That is why the story lingers. It is not only about a vanished ancient crisis. It is about the human habit of building futures from broken worlds. Ash falls, water rises, seasons fail, animals disappear, and still hands reach for stone seeds, shelter, and one another. The old world does not return. A new one forms in its place, fragile, imperfect, and astonishing. The long story of this disaster ends not with a single ruin, but with a quiet landscape after change. The ash has settled into the soil. The flood marks have hardened along old banks. The animals that once filled the distance are gone from many routes, leaving only bones, images, and memory. The camps that once followed the seasons have become harder to see, while other places grow thick with hearths, burials, grinding stones, storage pits, and the first deeper signs of staying. Nothing in this transformation is simple. It is not the triumph of one way of life over another. It is the slow turning of human existence under pressure, as people learn that the world can shift faster than memory expects. Across generations, the fear becomes quieter. Children are born who never saw the older herds. Others grow up beside fields that their grandparents may still have considered experiments. A spring becomes ancestral. A burial place becomes part of home. A patch of useful plants becomes a harvest. A shelter becomes a house rebuilt over the mark of an older house. The first crisis fades, but the habits it forced remain. People store food because hunger has a long shadow. They gather because isolation is dangerous. They watch the sky because seasons cannot be trusted completely. They tell stories because memory is another kind of shelter. What survives from this age is incomplete, but it's enough to sense the human shape inside it. There are hands striking stone with care, hands cutting reeds, hands carrying water hands, pressing seeds into earth without knowing how far the act will travel. There are families leaving places they love and others returning so often that the ground begins to hold them. There are losses no artifact can name. There are inventions too ordinary to seem miraculous until time reveals what they made possible. The disaster that forced humanity into a new age did not make people powerful in any final sense. It made them more dependent, more organized, more inventive, and more aware of the future. It gave them fields, stores, homes, rituals, obligations, and new forms of risk. It opened the road towards civilization, but it also left a warning beneath that road. Every human world is built inside nature's patience, and nature's patience is never guaranteed. So the final image is not a throne, a temple, or a city wall. It is a small fire under a changing sky. Around it, people sit close together, carrying fear and memory through the dark. Nearby seeds wait in the ground. Beyond the shelter, the old landscape is already becoming something else. And in that uncertain silence, humanity remains watching, learning, and beginning again.